The following video is an analysis of geopolitical and financial scenarios. Based on current defense trends and economic indicators, we project exactly what would happen if a radical restructuring of NATO were activated in 2026. This is a simulation. Welcome to the day after. This is not a documentary. This is a structural economic analysis of how a single policy demand, backed by conviction and leverage, reshapes a geopolitical order. By January 2026, within this scenario, something unprecedented occurs at the confluence of American pressure and European necessity. What follows is the largest rearmament cycle in a generation and a fundamental restructuring of how the transatlantic economy operates. This is the story of how a $13 trillion shift happens when power holders finally believe they have no other choice. Before we examine what happened, we need to understand what Trump actually got right. This is important because the narrative usually divides into two camps. Either Trump is a reckless isolationist threatening Western security, or he's a strategic visionary fixing decades of imbalance. The reality exists in the complicated middle. But in early 2025, something shifted. European leaders did something they swore they would never do. They admitted that Trump had a point. In 2024, when Trump began pushing NATO members to increase defense spending from 2% to 5% of GDP, most European governments treated it as a campaign promise, performative, destined to be walked back. By mid-2025, when the pressure didn't relent and the consequences started to materialize, something changed. European governments weren't being coerced into compliance. They were being forced into honesty about their own security situation. Let's establish the facts first. In February 2024, only 11 of NATO's 31 member nations met the 2% spending threshold. By late 2024, 23 members had reached it. That's progress, but not the dramatic transformation the media suggested. More importantly, reaching 2% was the baseline, what most countries did when they had no other choice. It wasn't ambition. It was the minimum acceptable threshold. Then came Trump's 5% demand. On the surface, it seemed unrealistic. Countries spending 5% of GDP on defense are typically nations at war. Only 9 countries globally spend that much: Israel, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and a handful of others facing existential threats. None are wealthy European democracies with stable domestic priorities. The proposal seemed to misunderstand the fundamental trade-off that defense spending represents for peacetime societies. But here's the micro-decision that made this scenario unique. Trump didn't demand immediate compliance. He set a timeline. By 2029, maybe 2035. Suddenly, the impossible became the merely difficult. Politicians in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels could now contemplate a path without appearing weak. They could plan, they could explain to their voters. They could show it was inevitable. By June 2025, at the NATO summit in The Hague, the shift begins. Germany announces it would reach 3.5% by 2029. Poland had already surpassed 4.5%. France suggested 3 to 3.5% by 2030. And then NATO's Secretary General announced a new collective target, 5% by 2035, broken into 3.5% for core defense spending and 1.5% for security infrastructure. Let's pause on the math, because it matters. If all 32 NATO members reach 3.5% core defense spending by 2035, NATO's collective defense budget would increase from roughly $1.28 trillion in 2023 to approximately $2.4 trillion by the mid-2030s. Over a 10-year implementation period, that represents approximately $11 trillion in additional spending. Add the 1.5% security infrastructure component, and you're looking at another $2 trillion in commitments. That's the $13 trillion figure. It's not sensationalism, it's arithmetic. But here's where the analysis becomes genuinely interesting. Trump didn't just demand more spending. He created conditions where that spending would benefit the American economy. NATO members began committing to preferential purchasing of American weapon systems. European arms imports from the U.S. had already jumped from 52% in the 2015 to 2019 period to 64% by 2020 to 2024. Now, with expanded budgets and specific commitments to buy American, the percentage would climb higher. Procurement announcements began flooding in. Germany ordering advanced air defense systems. Poland upgrading its mechanized forces with American equipment. The UK planning expanded naval capabilities using American platforms. This wasn't charity. This was American industrial policy dressed as collective security. And it worked. For the first time in a generation, American defense contractors didn't face a shrinking European market. They faced explosive growth. The aerospace, missile, radar, and software sectors of the American economy suddenly had guaranteed customers spending 5% of their GDP on modernization. But we need to examine a critical decision-making moment that most analysts ignore. Spain rejected the 5% target. Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez explicitly stated that Spain could meet its defense obligations at 2.1% of GDP. Geographically, Spain faces no direct military threat. Trump's response was significant. He threatened tariff retaliation. This is where the analysis becomes genuinely complex. Trump wasn't using tariffs as punishment for insufficient military spending. He was using the threat of tariffs to establish a principle that NATO membership came with economic obligations, not just military ones. Spain's resistance wasn't about defense capability. It was about economic resources and political capital. Threatening tariffs transformed it from a military negotiation into an economic one. Suddenly, Spain's refusal to increase defense spending became an issue affecting its farmers, its exporters, its manufacturers. Did this work? Spain eventually acquiesced to participate in the new defense framework. Not because Spanish leaders suddenly believed 5% was affordable, but because the economic cost of resistance exceeded the domestic political cost of compliance. This is how power actually operates at the level of the state. Now let's examine what changed in the global economy. The entire premise of European skepticism about American reliability collapsed when defense contracts began flowing. Companies employing tens of thousands of workers across Europe became dependent on American orders. German defense contractors building systems using American technology now had their entire business model tied to continued American engagement in European security. That's not a military alliance. That's an economic entanglement. Europe had been attempting to build strategic autonomy, a euphemism for reducing dependence on America. This rearmament cycle made autonomy impossible. France couldn't build a European air defense system while buying American missiles. Germany couldn't develop an independent defense industrial base while purchasing American jets. The continental strategy that had been quietly advancing for a decade simply died. Not through American military force, but through economic dependency created by Europe's own military choices. By late 2025, European defense spending had jumped to 381 billion euros annually, an 11% increase year over year. And it's momentum that's structurally locked in. Once you've increased military spending, once you've made contracts with American suppliers, once you've retrained personnel and restructured procurement, reversal becomes politically nearly impossible. This brings us to the trade component. In exchange for European compliance on NATO spending, Trump imposed tariffs on EU exports, 15% on most goods by July 2025. This was a scaled response, calculated to hurt but not break the European economy. The impact was significant. European exporters lost margin. Imported American goods became more expensive, raising prices for European consumers. This is Trump's actual negotiating genius. Not that he can force perfect outcomes, but that he can calibrate pressure to find the point where the other side accepts an unfavorable deal as preferable to confrontation. Here's where the strategy became self-reinforcing. Italy and France pushed back on extended EU tariff retaliation, arguing that a trade war would destabilize their economies. Germany, facing its own economic challenges, agreed. Spain, already weakened by its NATO resistance, couldn't sustain a position. The EU fractured on tariff response. Individual countries began making bilateral deals with Washington. By late 2025, the transatlantic trade relationship had been fundamentally restructured. Europe was paying higher prices for goods, but receiving an unprecedented inflow of American defense technology and weapons. But there's an element that the financial markets understood before policy analysts did. Once Europe committed to major defense spending increases, the structural demand for American goods, services, and technology would grow for a decade. That's permanent revenue redirection. American defense contractors suddenly had guaranteed expanding markets for a generation. Mid-roll CTA. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the mechanics of global power and economic strategy, make sure to subscribe. While mainstream media focuses on noise and outrage, we focus on the numbers and the strategy behind the headlines. Because understanding how systems actually work, not how we wish they work, is what separates informed observers from everyone else. The Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the Federal Reserve all adjusted their monetary policies in recognition of this shift. Defense spending is fundamentally inflationary. You're paying for weapons that will be destroyed or obsoleted, not consumer goods that satisfy demand. European central banks raised interest rates in anticipation of inflation. American interest rates stayed stable because the inflation was happening abroad. This created a structural advantage for American savers and borrowers, while increasing the cost of capital for European governments trying to finance their new defense budgets. This is the hidden mechanism of American advantage. When Europe spends money on defense procurement, it's buying products where the intellectual property, supply chains, and manufacturing expertise reside in America. A German tank-building contract means German factories assembling American engines, American electronics, American targeting systems. A Polish air defense deal means Polish technicians maintaining American software. A French naval contract means French shipyards installing American combat systems. The money flows out of Europe in both the purchase price and the perpetual licensing fees for American technology. Meanwhile, American defense companies aren't just earning revenue, they're harvesting data. Every weapon system sold to Europe comes with training requirements, maintenance contracts, upgrade pathways, and compatibility dependencies. That data feeds back into American research institutions, American universities, American think tanks, American defense research firms, all become centers of expertise because they're solving problems at scale for 32 NATO members simultaneously. A European defense contractor solving a problem in isolation, an American defense contractor solving the same problem with feedback from the entire NATO alliance. The asymmetry is structural. Here's where the $13 trillion figure becomes more than accounting. Over a 15-year implementation period, the total resource transfer from Europe to the American defense industrial complex, through both direct weapons purchases and indirect costs of higher interest rates, would exceed $13 trillion. That's wealth that would have been used for education, infrastructure, healthcare, or civilian innovation, redirected to military procurement and American industrial capacity. For the American economy, this is transformative. The defense sector suddenly faced explosive demand. That meant hiring, manufacturing expansion, supply chain development, technology advancement. The American Midwest, which had suffered from deindustrialization, suddenly had renewed demand for heavy manufacturing to supply European rearmament. But it also meant something less frequently discussed: American political realignment. Trump's support in manufacturing regions wasn't just about nostalgia or resentment anymore. It was about realized economic benefit. Companies that had opposed Trump in 2024 were winning contracts under Trump in 2026. Workers were watching hiring announcements. The political durability of this coalition became much stronger when backed by quarterly earnings reports and employment statistics. Now let's examine Europe's actual strategic position after this earthquake. Different countries faced different calculations. Germany's commitment to reach 3.5% by 2029 meant adding roughly 100 to 120 billion euros annually to its defense budget by the end of the decade. German defense spending, which had been constrained by political psychology stemming from historical memory, suddenly had to triple in size. This required not just increased spending, but fundamental restructuring of German industrial capacity. French attempts to maintain strategic autonomy proved constrained. French companies needed American components, and French doctrine required interoperability with NATO systems, meaning American standards and equipment. Poland, by contrast, embraced wholesale American integration enthusiastically, knowing that rearmament validated what had always been true. Poland would be armed by America according to American specifications at American prices to serve American-defined purposes. Italy faced explicit trade-offs. Money for defense meant cuts to pensions and health care. Spain's forced acquiescence created resentment that would fester politically. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, exceeded targets enthusiastically, knowing that higher European spending meant credible deterrence against Russia. Their military-to-GDP ratios rose to unprecedented levels. For populations who experienced Soviet occupation, the burden was less salient than the security it provided. The continent had doubled its military spending commitment and purchased enormous quantities of American weapons. It had accepted continued American technological dominance and lost the ability to develop independent defense capabilities. But it had also gotten what it needed: measurable improvements in defense capability and continued security against Russia. If Europe was now spending 5% of GDP on defense, it was committing to deny Russia control of Eastern Europe if the United States remained engaged. The cost was continued American dominance. The benefit was continued security. Europe had made a Faustian bargain with open eyes. This is where Trump's actual vision becomes visible. He wasn't trying to destroy NATO. He was restructuring it into something that served American interests more directly. Instead of America providing subsidized defense, allies would pay American rates for American protection with American technology at American terms. One might argue this is what NATO should have always been: a commercial arrangement rather than a security charity. But what's undeniable is that it worked. Europe committed to massive rearmament. European defense capabilities would measurably improve by 2030. Russian threats to Eastern Europe would become significantly costlier. American economic interests would benefit enormously. Now let's examine the technology dimension, because this is where long-term consequences become truly significant. When Europe committed to American weapon systems, it wasn't just committing to current-generation equipment. It was committing to a technological dependency relationship lasting decades. American defense contractors would have exclusive access to European defense budgets. European contractors would have limited access to sensitive American technology. Intellectual property would flow primarily one direction. American defense companies, with expanded access to European development and production needs, would accelerate innovation. Their research budgets would expand. Their engineering talent would grow. They would establish themselves as undisputed technological leaders in critical defense domains. European defense contractors would become secondary integrators, assembling American components into systems. Their innovation capacity would stagnate relative to American competitors. Technology that begins in defense sectors eventually migrates to commercial applications. Radar technology becomes weather forecasting. Communication systems become telecommunications infrastructure. Manufacturing techniques developed for precision defense manufacturing become applicable to commercial production. By locking Europe into American defense technology, Trump had inadvertently locked Europe into American technological leadership across adjacent civilian sectors for a generation. Consider also the energy dimension. Europe, having lost Russian gas supplies after the Ukraine invasion, became dependent on American LNG. European LNG imports from America jumped from 21 billion cubic meters in 2021 to 81 billion cubic meters by 2025. By 2030, America can supply 75 to 80% of European LNG imports. The combination of defense dependency and energy dependency created a structural relationship where European strategic autonomy became illusory. Europe became dependent on American military protection and American energy supplies simultaneously. Trump understood this intuitively. By pushing defense spending while maintaining energy export restrictions and tariff threats, he was creating a multi-layered dependency structure where Europe had limited options for independent action. Europe couldn't reduce defense spending without risking Russian aggression. It couldn't reduce American energy imports without facing energy shortages. It couldn't retaliate against American tariffs without risking American abandonment on security. The structure was elegantly constraining. But there's another dimension worth examining: supply chain vulnerability. Once European militaries retool their equipment to American specifications, they become permanently locked into American supply chains. If American suppliers face disruptions, whether from domestic political changes, corporate consolidation, or external shocks, European militaries have limited alternatives. European suppliers can't substitute because they don't have the intellectual property or manufacturing expertise. The relationship becomes one-directional dependence, masked as alliance. This creates vulnerability that cuts both ways. Europe can't easily diversify away from America without massive costs. But America also can't easily walk away from Europe without losing the revenue stream and geopolitical influence. The $13 trillion commitment creates mutual entanglement, but the entanglement favors America structurally because America controls the technology, the supply chains, and the standards. The second-order effects contained genuine complexity. If Europe was spending 5% on defense, it had to reduce spending somewhere else. Countries made different choices. Germany cut infrastructure investments. France deferred welfare expansions. Italy postponed pension reforms. Spain's social services faced pressure. These weren't catastrophic cuts, but they were real. They created political friction. They made European governments vulnerable to far-right challengers, promising to restore social spending without American defense mandates. This is the long-term vulnerability in this restructured alliance. It works as long as the threat is perceived as sufficient to justify the cost. But if 5 years pass and no Russian invasion occurs, if Ukraine stabilizes, if the security crisis fades, European publics will increasingly ask, why are we spending twice what we spent before on defense instead of on schools and hospitals? What is undeniable is that by January 2026, in this scenario, the transatlantic relationship has been fundamentally transformed. The era of American security provision to a Europe that got to focus on economic integration and social development has ended. Europe is now a rearmed continent, spending at levels it said were impossible, purchasing weapons from America at rates it deemed excessive, and accepting tariff burdens it promised to resist. The relationship structure has shifted from values-based partnership to transactional arrangement, with profound implications for how the alliance will function under future stress. Domestically in America, this was viewed as triumph. European elites who had lectured America on multilateralism had collapsed under the pressure of simple economic leverage combined with genuine security threat. The contradiction between what European leaders had said about American reliability and what they did, once forced to choose, was gratifying to Trump supporters and vindicated his fundamental critique. The lesson was clear. Talk about values is subordinate to calculations of interest. By early 2026, NATO looked stronger militarily and more fragmented politically than it had in decades. European defense capability was improving measurably. American defense contractors had secure revenue for a generation, but the glue that had held the alliance together, the sense that America and Europe shared fundamental commitments beyond security, had begun to dissolve. The alliance had been restructured from a political community into a commercial relationship. That might make it more durable economically, but politically, it's considerably more fragile. The question for 2026 and beyond is whether this restructured alliance will hold when tested. If the security crisis in Ukraine resolves positively, Europe will face pressure from electorates demanding their defense budgets be cut and money redirected to schools and hospitals. If it escalates, Europe will demand more American engagement than Trump might be willing to provide. If Trump leaves office in 2029, his successor might unwind tariff arrangements or signal commitment in ways that make Europe feel less need to spend massively on defense. Any of these scenarios would create pressure that could fracture the carefully constructed arrangement. For now, the restructuring is real, the commitments are made, the contracts are signed. But the foundation on which this arrangement rests, fear and immediate security need, is volatile. As that fear diminishes, as time passes without catastrophic Russian escalation, the arrangement will face its greatest test. Europe will have spent trillions on weapons and still depend on American protection. At that point, the political calculation changes. The question shifts from, can we afford not to rearm, to, can we afford to keep rearming while our schools crumble? Trump has gambled that he can restructure an alliance by making its members fear the consequences of its dissolution more than they fear the cost of sustaining it. That gamble has paid off in the short term. Whether it pays off long term depends on whether he's correct that alliances are ultimately transactional arrangements between powers with different interests. If the Ukrainian crisis resolves, if Russian threat perceptions decline, if a new American president changes tone and approach, Europe will have locked itself into a structure that no longer serves its interests. That's the genuine strategic risk embedded in this restructuring. This is the 2026 scenario. This is what happens when a transactional approach to alliance management encounters the real necessity of collective security. The outcome that emerges will reshape international relations for decades to come. But there's a larger lesson embedded in this scenario that extends beyond NATO. What we're witnessing is a fundamental shift in how great powers structure relationships with allies. The post-Cold War consensus was that alliances were built on shared values, democratic governance, and mutual commitment to liberal international order. That consensus has collapsed. What Trump is demonstrating is that alliances can be more efficiently constructed through explicit transactional terms: security for resources, commitment for payment, protection for preferential access. This has implications far beyond Europe. If Trump successfully restructures NATO on explicitly transactional grounds, he establishes a model for restructuring other alliance relationships. Japan might be next, pressured to spend more on defense and buy more American weapons. South Korea might follow. Taiwan would become a bidding situation. What price for American protection? The entire post-Cold War alliance system could be reconstructed on purely transactional grounds, eliminating the diplomatic niceties and values language that previously provided political cover. For China and Russia, this is simultaneously threatening and advantageous. Threatening because a more militarized Europe aligned with America is genuinely problematic, but advantageous because transactional alliances are inherently less stable than value-based ones. A NATO held together by shared values and shared identity can persist through crises. A NATO held together by fear and economic necessity becomes fragile when circumstances change. Competitors can reasonably assume that European commitment to the alliance is contingent on continued threat perception, which means threat reduction becomes a viable strategy. If you can convince Europe that the threat is diminishing, the alliance naturally weakens. Trump understood this intuitively, which is why his rhetoric about the Ukraine situation, his skepticism about continued American commitments, and his openness to negotiating with Russia are all carefully calibrated. They maintain the threat perception that sustains European spending. Remove the threat, remove the rationale for European rearmament. Maintain the threat, maintain the spending, and the American advantage. This creates a perverse incentive structure. For Trump's restructured alliance to hold, there must be a continuing Russian threat. For Trump to actually benefit from the restructuring, Europe must remain frightened enough to maintain its rearmament commitments. But for Trump to resolve the underlying conflicts and claim diplomatic victory, he would need to reduce the threat perception. These are contradictory objectives. Satisfying one would undermine the other. This is the deepest vulnerability in Trump's restructuring. It depends on maintaining a permanent state of managed crisis. If the crisis is actually resolved, the rationale for the restructuring disappears. If the crisis intensifies too much, Europe might conclude that the threat is existential and pursue autonomous defense capabilities. Trump has constructed a structure that only functions within a narrow band of threat perception. Too high, and Europe seeks independence. Too low, and Europe withdraws from commitment. The management of this narrow band will determine whether the restructured alliance survives beyond Trump's presidency. If you want to understand how geopolitical restructuring actually happens, not through grand speeches or dramatic confrontations, but through the accumulated pressure of leverage applied against changing circumstances, then you're watching the right moment in history. The next decade will determine whether Trump has rebuilt a stronger alliance or simply exposed the hollowness of commitments made only under duress. Subscribe to understand these transformations as they unfold, because the forces reshaping global order rarely announce themselves loudly. They operate through tariffs, defense contracts, and supply chain dependencies. And by the time their impact becomes obvious to the mainstream, the world has already fundamentally changed. Understanding how these mechanisms work is the responsibility of anyone trying to comprehend contemporary geopolitics.